My name is Matt Irwin. Some of you have seen me before, but for those that haven't, well, I do all sorts of things in photography. I've actually been in the photography world professionally for about 30 years. And in late 1990, early 1991, I created my very first card range. And what that means, that was about turning a 35mm black and white negative, and at the time it would have been an Ilford FP4, it was about turning that into something that could end up being printed 2,000 times onto a postcard and onto a greeting card. And not only was I doing that, but at the same time I was using the same negative in an enlarger to print, expose a piece of paper, print on it, put it through chemicals, and then have a print that I could sell at a market or in a shop. And then after about 10 or 12 years of doing that, I started to do what's known as Giclee printing, which is really just a fancy word for inkjet printing. And in this video, I want to start to talk about, because it's actually really complicated, and I'm going to do separate films on each of those sectors, but I'm going to talk about the beginnings of how do you prepare your files to go into those different environments. Let's talk about turning your shots, your negatives, your digital negatives into prints, books, posters, offset, whatever you want to do with it. I want to share it with you, so let's go! I want to start at the start, back in 1990, 1991, 30 years ago, and what it looked like to turn your photographs into something that could be printed on postcards and greeting cards, because that's what I did. Now back then, what happened is the images were actually analog captured, and then that analog capture was placed into film, not film as you and I know it, but a larger piece of film, and from that was created the printing plate. Now I'm not going to go into the details of that right now, there's a lot of details, but this was all done organically, all done analog. Film, bits of film, there was nothing digital about it. Then plates were made using acid, and from those plates, which would have tiny little dots, and those tiny little dots would represent where the ink was, and where there were no dots, it was where the ink was not. And then the ink that went onto the plate would then be passed to a blanket, and then from the blanket, and these would roll around, so the ink would roll around, it would pass it onto a blanket, it would roll onto the blanket, and then the blanket would put it on the paper. Amazing. This technology is amazing. And with the printers that I was using back then, they could do something like 12 to 15,000 pages. And we're talking A0 pages, so almost a metre, around a metre by 700 centimetres, so like 3 feet by 2 feet, just roughly. It could do 12,000 of those every hour. This is known as offset printing. So back then, that's how we did it. Hard, analog. The quality wasn't as good as it is today. Let's jump forward to today and how I prepare for making my calendars, my books, my journals, etc. when we are taking digital files to a state where they are ready to be printed offset. You may or may not know that your camera records its information in RGB, and that is red, green, and blue. You may or may not know that files are printed in CMYK. That stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and for some strange reason, K means black. We have to get an RGB raw digital file from RGB to CMYK. That means you've got 3 colours making up the full colour spectrum, and then you've got, well, kind of 4 colours if you count black as a colour. And there's another thing that you need to be really aware of when you're converting from RGB to CMYK, and that is colour gamut. RGB has a much wider color gamut. You can go into some crazy rich colors that it is not possible for them to be recreated in the real world. Now you can push that a little bit by using what's called a spot color. And what that means is you have CMYK, and the mix of those makes up the full world. And then you can have a spot color, which is specifically the color that you're trying to create. That gives you a bit more latitude here and there. It doesn't necessarily increase your gamut that much, but then you can have colors like gold or silver, other things like that. And also your fifth and sixth colors, not only for extra spot colors, but they can also be used for spot varnishes and other things. I know, we're diving deep, and I said I wouldn't dive quite that deep. Let's talk about creating those files though. So in Photoshop is one place where you can do these types of conversions. And you just have to be mindful, especially if you're someone who likes to crank your colors until your brain explodes, which I don't. You need to be aware that you can't get those same colors when you are offset printing. It's not possible. So you will get a disappointment. You'll go, oh, my reds are not as crazy red, my blues are not as crazy blue, and so on. There's various colors. Colors like yellow seem to stay a bit more within reality, but reds and blues and greens, these are difficult colors, and sometimes your images will end up looking quite different from what you wanted or hoped for them to be. Maybe that's one of the reasons why for the last 25 years I haven't done crazy color. Well, you know, I never did crazy color because I was doing black and white only. Well, not quite only, but I was doing black and white for the first decade or more. And then when digital came along, it was the easiest trap to just hyper saturate things. I never really liked crazy color. I wanted the world to look as realistic as possible. If you want things to look crazy colorful in printing, much more difficult. You go into Photoshop and you have the opportunity then, once you've done the conversion, and there's a step here that you need to be mindful of. Every printer prints on their press with their own profiles. Now there are some standards around the world, and there might be a printer here in Australia that works the same as they do in China or works the same as they do in the USA, but not all printers do the same thing. So you have to be aware of their profile, and you have to put that into the mix of creating your file. So you go RGB, you're used to what it looks like as an RGB PSD or a JPEG, you bring it into Photoshop. First thing you do is make it CMYK, the next thing you do is you make it for the profile of your printer, and your file looks completely different. This is true, this is what happens. Sometimes some files don't change much at all just because of what colors are in them, and other files change a lot. So then you basically have to go back to you've now got a CMYK file, and you've got to adjust it using the color sliders to how you see fit, to whether you're going to try and bring it as close to where it was when you brought it in originally as an RGB, or whether this is now an opportunity to actually make a new version of your file. Because sometimes you find you just can't bring it back to the place that it was, and so you have a quandary of going, well, I still love this image. Is it ruined now that I don't have the colors and I can't create the colors? Can I still run with it? And sometimes you can't. Or you choose to redo this file. It's got to be new. You've got to find new advantages in it. And again, we all create our files, we all do our art based on what we like and what we feel. So I can show you where the sliders are and which ones to pull, but I can't tell you how to make a file that suits what you originally created and maybe is some sort of compromise that you then have to take to print. But that is the reality. You cannot get RGB files looking exactly the same in CMYK, especially if you're pushing your reds and your blues and some other areas. So that's what you've got to do. You make a file, you make a CMYK file. Now, because it is 4 channels instead of 3 channels, the files get 30% bigger. You might have a 100 megabyte file that becomes a 133 megabyte file. Everything gets bigger. You've got to make sure it's in the right color space. And at that point in time, if you're using, say, InDesign, you drop your files into InDesign and they are print-ready files. Makes your life easy if you just start with the print-readies. often a mistake. I'm going to call it a mistake. Often a mistake I make, and it's not really a mistake because when I'm designing something, I don't know always which are going to be the final files. I will do my InDesign layup with RGB files, even just JPEGs, because you end up, if you have something which has 200 images in it, it becomes enormous. You have an enormous amount of replication of data. So I will use lower res RGBs, and then when I've finally finished the layout of the book, I've made my decisions, then I have to go back and make the CMYKs. So it depends a little bit on how you choose your layout and put together your calendar or your book as to what you do first. Sometimes it can be quite an effort to go back and find the original files and go through this process when you think you're finished, and actually you're not, because this process is a lot of work. And when you're color correcting, which is what I call it, when you're color correcting 200 files to go to print, and you think you've finished the layout and the words and everything's been proofed, and you've suddenly got to do that process at the last minute, and with 200 files, that might take a couple of days. Like, it really can be very time consuming. If you just do the maths. If you spend 5 or 10 minutes on each file, that means you're doing 6 to 12 files an hour, which means in a 10-hour day, you're doing 60 to 120 a day. You can see how 200 can take a couple of days. So just be mindful. That it's a heavy lifting process. It's hard work on your computer. It's a lot of data wrangling. Then your files are done. InDesign has a preflight, and what preflight does is it puts together all the collateral, all the logos, all the text, all the files. It puts it in, it collects everything from all over your computer. It does the work for you, plonks it in one folder, and that's finished, done. Some print houses will then want you to give them all of that original InDesign and your files. Other print houses will say if you can make a press ready CMYK PDF, that's what they want. So you just have to ask your press house what they want. So that's really how we create that's the process of creating files for offset printing. It's very exacting. You have to get all the bits and pieces right. You've got to decide, I mean, you can decide things like whether you want to work with 16-bit or 8-bit files. Most printers will say we want 8-bit. 16-bit's fine. You can work in 16-bit, and obviously that maintains the integrity of gradations way better, but usually at the last minute, everything gets turned to 8-bit. So that's really, that is a high-level overview, and there's way more detail, but that's a high-level overview. I would love you to let me know if you would like a video which is an even deeper dive on getting into creating your files for offset. The other thing I quickly wanted to touch on is getting your files ready for Giclee inkjet fine art printing. Luckily, the printers that we print with, even so they have CMYK inks, they're very happy to work in RGB, and they do all the work for you. So you can literally be in Capture One or Lightroom, you've got your raw file, you export it out as a PSD, which this software can do, all of them, pretty much everything can give you a PSD. If it can't, it'll give you a TIFF. You don't want to go to JPEG because you're already starting to compress, so always keep it. For print, you want to maintain detail. So a PSD or a TIFF or an EPS, any of those, and there you have your file. Now, depending on what engine you use to print with, because there are different bits of software that you can print with, which is another whole deep dive. But me, for the almost 20 years that I've been using these types of printers, I've just simply printed from Photoshop, and that has done me just fine. So in Photoshop, you open your file as you love it and see it. And because these printers have a much wider color gamut, unlike offset printing, you don't have to worry about adjusting your files, and you will get the majority of what you see on screen. If you've got everything set up correctly, the majority of what you see on screen will end up on the paper if you've got a good printer. The only thing that needs to happen from that point on, once you go into the engine that's the actual print engine, is you have to make sure that the paper or canvas or whatever, we call it a substrate because there's lots of different substrates, you have to make sure that the substrate you're printing on has a color profile for your printer. So in other words, let's say you're printing on an Ilford luster paper. You need to make sure that there's a profile being made for your paper that matches your exact printer. Once you put that profile in, you are good to go. If you've got your color workflow correct, the files come out. Now, I can't speak for working on a Windows machine, but I've worked on Macs since the early 90s, and especially since we've gone to flat screens, LCDs. One of the reasons you pay more money for a Mac is the screens are color corrected. So I've never had to worry about it. Even so, people will still try and sell you tools for color correcting your screens. It's just simply never been something that I've had to do. And Mac screens, I've got about 5 iMacs, 6 iMacs. Whether I'm at home, in the office, at the warehouse printing, they all look the same. They are all color corrected and they never change. They just simply never change. The current generation iMacs that have been going from 2012 to now all look the same. It's very impressive. So once you get all that stuff matched up, and what you're seeing on screen is 99.9% going to be what you get on paper, as long as you've got your profiles right. So it's that simple. Get your paper profile to match your printer. You've got your RGB files. There's quite a few settings you've got to go through, and paper sizes and margins, and these printer drivers are complex. And again, if you'd like me to do a deep dive on the actual printer driver settings, because there's like 30 settings in there, very happy to do it. So please let me know that too in the comments below. So here is a quick overview of the very technical deep dive into printing your work, whether it's offset or Giclee printing. I'm very happy to talk about more. I've been doing both things for a very, very long time, and I have been through all the trials, and I know a lot about it. And I love knowing a lot about it because it means I can turn my work into pieces that are real, that are on the wall. Mark, let's throw me something that looks impressive. This is printed on one of my machines, the Epson 11880, and it is absolutely color accurate. So once you get your profiles right, I don't even have to think about it. What I see in Capture One, what I see in Photoshop, is 99.9% or 100% correct. That's how good it is. And I can print this over and over again for 20 years and it looks identical. So yeah, I'd love to share more of that with you. If you guys are interested, please let me know in the comments below. As always, if this is your first time here, it has been so good to see you. I hope it's been informative. If so, please subscribe. Please share, it makes us all smarter. Please like, it helps get the word out there. And if you want to watch over 200 episodes, click on the Matter in Photography down the bottom here, all right? See you later. I'm going to become a human picture book. See ya.